Welcome to Pieces of the Past. My name is Deborah. I have a passion for fiber arts and creating new things from old. Join me on my journey as I explore the endless possibilities, the tools, and the techniques to create new pieces of the past. I thought in this video that I would share with you the blocks that I showed you how to dissect in the last video. The video that we just put out called How to Make a Block Without a Pattern. If you didn't watch that video, you can go back and see how I dissected some patterns, just random patterns, to figure out how the blocks were put together. But I didn't show any of the sewing or the measurements or anything like that. So I wanted to do that in this supplemental video. Okay, so we're going to start with the 9-patch. This is the basic block. I told you that in the last video that you can do. It's just a simple square. The simple square can be any size you want, and then you would sew the squares together in a row, and then you would sew those rows together. So when you're doing these, the first thing I want to talk about is seam allowance. Any of the blocks that I show you, we're going to have a seam allowance added to that. So this right here is a 2.5 inch block, and the seam allowance is 1/4 inch in quilting. So I have a 1/2 inch added to the finished size of the square. So when this is finished and in a quilt, this square right here is going to be 2 inches because this is a 2.5 inch cut square. Okay, and so when I sew these together, it's going to take off this 1/4 inch of each of these. All right, and this too is going to take off 1/4 inch, so it's just going to shrink up a little bit. Let's go sew those together, and I'll bring this block back, and then we'll move on to the next one. What I'm doing here, instead of cutting my threads, I'm doing what's called chain piecing. And you sew things in a row, one after another, just like this. And then when you get to the end of your set, then you cut the threads. And then you have a chain. And now I'm going to sew the rows together. Anytime you have multiples of something that you have to sew over and over again, which you do in quilting a lot, this is what you want to do. You want to chain piece. When you're quilting and you're pressing your blocks or ironing them, you want to press the seam towards the darkest color if you can. In a 9-patch, it works out pretty well because the dark is always going to be opposite. And what I do is I lay the light piece on the table and I push against the seam with the iron, and it naturally flattens it out like that. And then this one will be opposite of those two. I have to push it out that way and this way. See how the seams are over on the dark orange. Okay, so then we're going to take these back to the machine and sew them together into our block. First part of this video is a basic quilting primer, really. When you're putting your seams together on your blocks, you want to rub them together where they nest into each other, and then stitch them. 1/4 inch seam allowance. Basically seat these together like that. Let's stitch the next one. Okay, and that will show you. There you go. And so this one goes there. It does not go there. Okay. So we're going to put it on over here. So we're going to fold it over. Right sides together. And we're going to stitch 1/4 inch. And there you have it. Okay, so there's our finished 9-patch block. So the squares on this one were 2.5, and this is now a 6.5 inch block. It will be a 6 inch finished block when it's in the quilt, because you still have the 1/4 inch out here to take up in the seams. All right, so that's the basic 9-patch block. Very simple, great beginner pattern. So we'll move that one over and then we'll go to the next one. The next one that I showed in the last video is the rail fence. The rail fence goes from the squares and it moves into rectangles. All right, so this is a typical rail fence block. You can see this whole square here. And what you do is you make this piece right here and you make it 4 times, and then you put that all together and you get the rail fence block. That's hard to say. And you can make a quilt that looks somewhat like this. Now on this one, you have to add your seam allowances, right? So each piece is going to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. Anytime you're sewing quilting blocks, you're going to have a 1/2 inch disappear every time you sew 2 of them together. You're going to have this 1/4 inch on this one and the 1/4 inch on this one disappear into the seam allowance, right? So these are 1.5 inch strips. I've got 4 of them, and then I take out 1, 2, 3 1/2 inches. That's 1.5 inches. So then I take out 1.5 inches. Whatever I'm left with is going to be this length right here that I need this length to be, because I'm turning this, right? And I hope that makes sense. So it's basically going to be, I believe this is 4.5, isn't it? Yeah, 4.5. So to get this 4.5, to get these to collapse down, I need them to be 1.5 inch strips. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew this all together and you can see what the block looks like. Here we go. So just like on the last one, I'm going to chain piece this one so it goes quicker. And in this case, instead of chain piecing the sets together, I'm going to do all the orange and green together, chain one after another, and then I'm going to chain piece these one after another, and then I'm going to lay it all back out after I press it and then pick it up again and chain piece. So I'm doing the orange and the greens. One of the main reasons that you chain stitch these pieces together is because in a lot of domestic machines you have to hold the thread back here to keep it from knotting up and jamming your machine, and this way you don't have to do that. It holds it for you because you're just stitching on to the next thing. Okay, there's our chain of logs. And I could have just kept going. In fact, I think I will. I'm going to do these as well. So I have this little gadget that sits there, and it has a rotary blade in it. I think these are 3D printed. Anyway, and when you're chain piecing, they're great because you can just chop your chains apart. As in the 9-patch, I'm pressing to the dark side of things, which would be this orange. And in this case with the rail fence, I also want to make sure I press all of the seams in the block to the same direction. So it happens to be that it goes from dark to light, so it's fine. But this is the direction that the block is going to be put together. Okay, so like this. So the seams, I want to make sure they all go, you know, are all pressed that way towards the dark in this case, which is handy. Okay, so I sewed the 4 identical blocks together for the rail fence, and now I'm pressing them up to the dark like I showed you before, and then we're going to lay them out and see what they look like. I do have a tutorial on how to make these boards as well, if you're interested in that. It's in the videos. Alright, so it goes the dark up there, dark over here, dark here, and dark here. When you press something that has a lot of seams on one side and no seams on the other, you want to press towards the one with no seams on the other, because it would be way too bulky to press it that way. In this case, I'm pressing towards the light piece, but that's okay. And then on this one, I'm actually pressing towards the dark piece. But that allows the ones that you sewed together that are so bulky to be laying flat like that. All right, now let's see, how did we have that laid out? Like this, right? Correct. Okay, so we're going to lay this way. And by doing that, what I just did with the ironing, it allows you to nest this seam, and they're going opposite directions. See that? And in this case, it's getting bigger, so I will put a pin in it. Right there in the middle, because I definitely want those to meet in the middle. And then the rest of it is just end to end. So we'll sew that. So in this case, you can't help but press towards at least one side that has the seams. So just pick one. In this case, I decided to press against this dark one. Okay, so we finished the rail fence. That one's nice. I really like those colors. It is an 8-inch block, so 7.5 finished. Kind of weird measurements, but there you go. So let's move on to the next one. The next one is called the single chain and knot, and it is also in that previous video. It looks like this, the block does. The squares that I chose to use are 2.5-inch squares, which means that this small piece right here, these 4 pieces have to be sewn together to equal this piece here, this block, this square, because all of these are 2.5-inch, right? To get that, these are going to have to be 1.5-inch blocks. Now, 1.5 and 1.5 equals 3, but when you take out that 1/2 inch in the middle for those 2 1/4-inch seam allowances right there, you're going to end up with a 2.5-inch block. So then they will all be equal. So we have 4 of those in the corners. We got to sew those together first. Then we're going to sew those. I got me some handy little arrows here to show you. We're going to sew those to each other in rows, right? Like this row, this row, this row, and this row. That's after we do the little square corners. And then we're going to sew those rows together. This will be a row. We'll sew it to this one, to this one, to this one, to that one. Okay? That is where these boards come in handy. I do have a tutorial on how to make these boards, because when you're laying these blocks out, it's really, really helpful to have, I have a blank one over here, to have these boards. So check that out. I'll put a link in the description below for that video. So you can use that. And I think that's it on this one. This one is called single chain and knot. So we're going to go sew this together. Okay, so I have sewn together the single chain and knot block. Because of the sizes that I chose for my squares, it turned out to be a 10.5-inch square, unfinished, so it'll be a 10-inch square finished. One thing I did notice when I was making this particular block is that when you're quilting, try really hard to make sure that your directional prints go the same way. So I don't know if you can see in this block, but all of these right here, these dots, I don't know if you can see that or not, these are little hearts. And in this block over here, the hearts are going the other way. I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to take it out, but it makes your quilts look a lot better if all of your directional stuff goes in the same direction. Just keep that in mind when you're quilting. Try really hard to keep them straight. The one thing about this video is that I wanted to do this, to sew these together, to show you that these are super easy blocks to sew, and you don't have to be, especially as a beginner, you don't have to be limited to just sewing squares together. There are so many blocks that you can do that are super easy, just straight seams. Okay, so we're going to take what we just sewed together, the 9 patch and the rail fence, and we're going to make them into this block This is called building blocks. And you will notice in the last video we dissected this pattern so that you could see what was going on here. But if you notice here, there is a 9-patch block right there. And then right here, there is a 3-part rail fence. So what's going on here is you have a 9-patch, 3 rectangles, another 9-patch, and same thing going on down here. And then you have the 3 rectangles on each side, and then you have 1 center square. Now the center square is the important part, because whatever size that is the size that these squares have to be to sew the whole thing together. So I think this is a, yeah, 3.5. This is a 3.5 inch square. So these 3, when they're sewn together, have to equal 3.5 inches, these 3 rectangles. They are 1.5 inch rectangles, which would be 1.5, that's 3, that's 4.5 inches if you just laid them next to each other, so that's too big. But you're going to take out 1/2 inch every time you sew 2 seams together. You're taking out 1/4 inch on this side and 1/4 inch on this side. That's 1/2 inch. So on this, I'm taking out 1 inch by sewing it together. It's going to get smaller, and then that's going to equal my 3.5 inch block, square. And same thing here, 1.5 inch squares. They're going to collapse down when I sew them together, and they're going to make a 3.5 inch as well. Then we're going to sew the whole thing together to get this block. Okay, so let's go sew that. Okay, so I've sewn together the, what is this called? Building blocks block. And it looks like that. I just absolutely love this block. I don't know why. Maybe the colors. I don't know. But I really, really like it. And all it was squares and rectangles. That's it. In the previous video, there's a link below to that, I covered dissecting the blocks so you could figure out what they were being made from. Squares are the most common thing that quilt blocks are made from. Then you get into rectangles, which adds a little bit of design, right? And then the third most popular thing to put in a quilt block that gives you more rounded movement and more movement, you can make your colors move with this particular block, is a 1/2 square triangle. Now I covered this in the last video, so I'm not going to rehash it here, but I am going to do the churn dash block, which incorporates that half square triangle in it. This is the churn dash block, and these are the colors I chose for mine. There is a center square just like on the last block that I just sewed together. There are 2 rectangles right here, and then this is the new element here. This is the 1/2 square triangle. So for this one, these squares are, the center square is 3.5 inches. So I cut these squares out here to be 3.5 inches. I cut one of my color and one of my background. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to take them to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew from corner to corner, and then I'm going to trim off the smaller, one of the sides, and I'm going to keep the big part and put the smaller triangles away for later for some other thing. But what that's going to end up giving me is this look right here. It's a 1/2 square triangle. Half of the square is a triangle, the other half of the square is a triangle. 1/2 square triangle, right? And I'm going to make 4 of those, and that's all there is to this block. So I'm going to go do that now, and I will meet you back here. So these are my 2 squares, and I'm going to lay one on top of the other, and then I'm going to sew from one corner all the way across the other corner diagonally. And I have this tape on my machine that I put here, so I have this red line to follow. It goes right up to the needle, so that's what I'm going to follow to keep this straight. If you didn't have that, you could draw a line from corner to corner and stitch on the line, and that works too. So here we go. Okay, and I'm going to chain piece these. So I'm going to do the same thing all 4 times. And then I'll put the block together and I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. Okay, so I have sewn together the Churn dash block. This is what the pattern looked like, and this is what the block looks like. These are my leftover triangles. One thing I did think about when I was doing this, and I wanted to tell you, especially if you're a beginner quilter, is that when you're doing this type of half square triangle sewing, you're probably going to be sewing on the bias, which means diagonally across the grain. And so there's a lot of stretch in that. You need to be very, very careful when you sew from corner to corner diagonally that you're not pulling on it, or not pulling on it, because that will make it all rippled and it won't fit into your block flat and nice. Okay, so just be careful when you're working with bias. That's why I do them as squares and I sew from corner to corner. Then I cut off the excess triangles. So anyway, isn't that pretty? It's a nice block. This one you could actually use the same background and just make the churn dash part different colors. That would be really cool. So we're going to keep doing the half square triangles in the next one. This is a half square triangle. I think I showed that in the last video, so you get an actual representation of what it is. Now, the next block we're going to do is the pinwheel block, and I've laid it out here. And I don't have a paper picture of it, but I do have it laid out here for you to see. And again, you can make these blocks any size you like. Just take your solid square, and whatever size that is, you need to make the other pieces that go with it that size so that you can sew them together. All right? That's what we've been doing through all of these. We've been making the side pieces or the corners or whatever the same size as this main block that we're working with, the solids, so that they all go together. They can all be sewn together. So when this one's finished, I do have a picture of the quilt. This is the quilt that it will make. Okay, here is the actual block that we're making. It's 5 pinwheels, and when you look at this quilt without that, it looks like this is the block right here. And then it confuses you as to how to put this thing together, right? But if you look at this, it's actually 5 pinwheels, and 5 more, and 5 more, and so forth. And the way you put them together, the pinwheels all meet in the center of these blocks here to form this pattern. So I think that's just really a cool pattern. And so I'm going to go sew this together, and I will be back here in just a minute. Your time, just a minute, to show you the finished product. Okay, so I'm back, and I have now sewn together my pinwheel block. This is what the block was going to look like right here, the 5 pinwheels, and this is how it turned out. Let's see, it's like that. So there you go. These are all half square triangles, and these are squares. Took a little longer to do this one, I think, than any of the others, only because there's so many little seams in here. And the one thing that I will say about this one is that this is one of the few times where I would press the seam, the middle seam of the pinwheel open. In quilting, you generally press to one side or the other, except when you have a whole bunch of seams that are meeting in one spot, and then you kind of want to open them up and press them open like you would in clothing. So that makes it lay flat. So there's my pinwheel block. Okay, and the last block for this video is called Hayes Corner, and you saw this one in the How to Make Any Block video. This was the last one, I think. Anyway, Hayes Corner. It looks like this. I chose these colors. Let's see, turn it like this. Okay, so what we have going on here is a 4 patch. You've got 2 rectangles and a single patch there, and then you've got a long one here, short rectangle here and your half square triangle. So that's the block. So in this case, instead of making 4 identical corners and then putting them all together, you would make this in sections. Yeah. So you're going to put together the 4 patch, and then you're going to put this one onto that. You're going to put these 2 together and do your half square triangle together, put this on it, put this on here. So these together, get my handy little arrows out. Haha. So these together, right? And then you do the same thing over here, and then you put them together. Hope that makes a little bit of sense. Before I forget, I'm going to put pictures of all of the ones that I have done in these 2 videos. The blocks are the same. There are more blocks in the first video than in this one. I cut it down a little bit just because I'm doing the sewing in this video. But I'm going to put in this video notes to each of the blocks and what measurements I used, so that you can either make those blocks the way you want them or figure out how to make them a different size for yourself. So watch for that. There will be a link in the description of how to get that. So I'm going to go sew this together, and we will see what the block looks like. Hopefully it will look like that. So here we go. All right, so this is the last block, and this is what it's supposed to look like, and this is what mine looks like. I think it turned out really cute, almost like a china plate or something. Very nice. So the whole point of this video and this exercise, the last video and this video, was to help you learn how to dissect a pattern that you see that you like, and without necessarily having to go out and buy the pattern, because it could be a pattern like this where it looks difficult, but it's really not if you take it apart and do it in pieces. Okay? And it also, another part of this exercise was to help you be able to resize patterns and make them whatever size you like. So you could make this block, but you could make it smaller or bigger. It doesn't matter. So I will have note files. I will have a note file with all of the patterns that I covered in this video, because I showed you how to sew them and how I put them together. I will have my measurements in there for each one, so you could take that and just go with it. You could make your own blocks and your own quilt, or you could resize those blocks and to your preference, however you would like to do that. So let's go back through these real quick. We've got Hayes Corner, we've got the pinwheels, we've got the churn dash, we have building blocks, the single chain and knot, the rail fence, and back where we started, the 9 patch, the simple 9 patch. So I hope that even as a beginner quilter that you will be able to use these blocks and make some beautiful quilts. And I really appreciate you joining me for this one. I know it was kind of scattered, but it kind of goes with the previous video. So if you haven't caught that one yet, go back and watch it. We've got the link in the description below, and the link to the note file will be down there as well. Thank you very much. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe. That would be awesome. Until next time, see you later.